Right, guys, it's a little bit past start time, so we'll get cracking. I'm going to introduce David Jorm from the console, doing his presentation on CVE, his logjammed, CNVD as nearly as bad, and my heart bleeds for the whole mess. So guys, if I could just remind you to vote at the end of the presentation on what you thought. You can do that via the leave feedback option on the app. If you actually click on the little green bar under the presentation, it'll take you through to the opportunity where you can ask questions. We'll then field all those questions at the end based on kind of what time we have available and how many questions we get. So you do actually have to click on the button. It'll take you through to a next screen, which is where you can put discussions and question asking. Anyway, in the meantime, I'll pass it over to David. If you can give him a round of applause to welcome him.
Hey, I'm just going to check the lapel mic works. Is the sound level good? Cool. Alrighty, so my apologies for the cringeworthy title, and my apologies if anybody noticed what's wrong with this slide deck. We didn't get a 2016 template, so I just used the 2015 one. So just an introduction on myself. I've been doing security work for 17 years now, but in a full-time capacity only for about the last 6 years. I was Red Hat's Java security lead for several years, went on to be the manager of half of Red Hat's security team, and then in December 2015 I joined a startup which was called IIX but is now called Console. We do software-defined networking, and I'm the engineering manager for the back end of that, the network automation of an MPLS mesh, and I'm also the technical security lead for the company. But I love trolling. I love finding new zero-day and popping shells, so there's a lot of good trolling here. And one of the easiest things to troll is the whole CVE process in Mitre, because they're quite awful. Just an outline of what we'll go through here, but there's no point reading through every one of those. So I'm guessing you've all heard of CVE. Actually, this would be useful, a show of hands. Anybody who hasn't heard of CVE? No, good. Okay, right. Oh, they're ashamed. That's good. So you've all seen, CVE is used as a canonical identifier for vulnerabilities, and when they're being referred to in advisories, in the media, etc., you should use the CVE identifier. It was concocted in the late 90s because they increasingly had this problem that there was no canonical identifier. One of the sort of canonical examples that they have of this problem was the PHF vulnerability, if anyone is as old as me and remembers that. There's lots of fun to be had with vulnerable PHF servers. And there were about 8 different identifiers for it because, Symantec would have their identifier for it, and some other vendor would have their identifier for it, and then the Red Hat distribution of that code would have their identifier for the vulnerability, and so on and so forth. And so they sat down and said, we need just one standard, a canonical identifier for the vulnerability, and it's CVE. Now, the way it actually got implemented is interesting. Mitre Corporation, Mitre is an acronym, I forget what it stands for, that actually operates the CVE program, is effectively an arm of the US government. They're technically a non-profit corporation, but their exclusive role is operating technical programs under contract for the US federal government. They manage NIST, for example, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which produces NVD and other downstream products from CVE. And through the National Cybersecurity Federally Funded Research something, they created and operate the CVE program. So the whole thing is completely bankrolled by the US government, and its primary purpose is to serve the goals of the downstream consumers in the US government. If it's not within that scope, it's not their priority. So remind you of anything. Can anyone tell me what these 3 countries have in common that are highlighted? Yeah, they're the only ones that do not use the metric system. So my point is, the US doesn't have a very good track record of adhering to international standards, but we've let them create one here. For reference, by the way, that's Myanmar and Liberia, but this clicker's gone haywire, so I'm going to not try and do that. There we go. Okay, so the history of the CVE program. In 2003, they published a report as a kind of milestone update saying, hey, we're making a lot of traction with this. 4 years in, we've got 29 organizations, which can mean software vendors, SaaS vendors, non-profits, et cetera, that are participating, and we're covering 43 software products. Software products are generally defined by CPE, which is another standard for identifying the product. And today they claim over 150 organizations and over 300 products being covered. In 2002, as I said, the main goal here is to actually serve the needs of the downstream users within the US government community. And in 2002, it was actually mandated that it be used. So rather than, well, we have this standard and you should probably use it, it was mandated if you are a US government agency, you must be a consumer and advocate of CVE. And that kind of codified the whole thing. A growth milestone occurred in the last couple of years that we had the CVE 10K problem. That the original format was you have CVE for the year that it applies to, and then a 4-digit code. So once you have 10,000 or more vulnerabilities in a year, you overflow that, and that we got very close to reaching that point in 2014. So that forced Mitre to come up with a new standard that added a digit, basically. There's a lot of back and forth. You should have seen the mail list. It was hilarious, the amount of finagling that went on between all of these big corporate players just for adding a digit, a single digit, to the standard. Now, the interesting thing about this coverage is we're talking a lot about products and organizations. What about open source? The vast majority of software that's actually used today on the server side is open source. You might have a commercial app somewhere, but if you look at the whole stack, you're going to have OpenSSL, you're going to have Nginx, you're going to have Linux, et cetera, everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And how is that stuff handled? Because the model that this was designed for was you have a vendor that produces a product, that ships a patch, and they can assign CVE IDs. So this delegation of authority is to CNAs, CVE naming authorities. So for example, Microsoft, Cisco, they can go and say, okay, we produce Cisco IOS. Whenever there's a vulnerability in Cisco IOS, we will ship a patch, and we will be assigned a pool of CVE IDs so that we can allocate CVE IDs to our own vulnerabilities. Because we're the canonical source of truth here on what is and is not a vulnerability in a Cisco product. So delegate that authority to us, and we can do it ourselves. This runs into the problem, as I said, with open source software. Who does it for open source? Historically, there was a kind of informal agreement that Red Hat would do it on behalf of any and all open source projects. But this ran into a bit of trouble around 2014 because there's a guy called Kurt, who I'll talk about later. He used to work for me, he used to report to me at Red Hat, and he's the kind of guy where every week when I'd call him up for his one-on-one, he'd let me know whether or not he was wearing pants that day. He found that to be important information to convey. And he's been probably the largest assigner of CVE IDs ever, and was doing this and made what some considered to be, I think it was controversial, some technical mistakes in assignment. And Mitre threatened to revoke this privilege from Red Hat and say, you shouldn't be allocating CVE IDs because you're getting it wrong. So how do we do it? Anyway, that's a bit of an aside. So the process, in theory, is that, let's ignore the open source problem, it gets delegated to a CNA. A CNA is responsible for allocating this ID, with Mitre acting as kind of the root backup CNA. If there is no other CNA, you go to Mitre directly. You contact them with details of the vulnerability, they give you a CVE ID, and then when you're publishing all of that information, you're writing up your advisory, you use the CVE ID that they gave you. So how does that actually work in practice? So here's a good example. I set up the ONOS security team. It's an open source SDN product, and this is back in 2015. We found a pretty straightforward denial of service attack through the data plane. So I emailed the OSS security list, emailed Mitre, and said, can you please allocate a CVE ID? And I think the turnaround time on this was about, 6 days. So not ideal, but I think it spanned a weekend. I only had to ask once, and I got my CVE ID, no questions asked. So that's process success. What about other times? I don't know if you're aware, but one of my fascinations is glorious Democratic People's Republic of Korea, who produced Red Star OS, the best Linux distribution in the world. And, but of course, it ships with the root account disabled because you couldn't give that to the people. And people leaked copies of Red Star OS via a Russian exchange student. got a hold of it, managed to swap out the Korean strings for English strings, started pen testing it, and of course found several ways to break out of the sandbox and get root. So it's a local PrivS vulnerability. It's all written up there. It's very clearly described. So I sent an email off saying, can you please assign a CVE ID to this issue? It's a straightforward, well-documented security issue. And I got crickets. No reply whatsoever. So I thought, all right, I'll go to them privately. And went just, not on the OSS security list, just to Mitre directly and say, so what gives? Why can't I have a CVE ID? And I called them out. I'm a bit of a troll, as I said, and basically said, I think that you're getting geopolitics mixed up in the CVE assignment process. And I think that you won't assign a CVE ID for Red Star OS because it's from North Korea and you're effectively government employees. Please explain. Be happy to share these slides so you can read through, but I think reading through my email correspondence line by line is probably not the most exciting thing in a presentation. So they got back to me. Steve Christie, who was the CVE editor, we'll hear more about him later, said they don't meet our criteria. Now the really interesting one here, no official distribution channel, I was just going to go and set one up and say, I was also thinking about doing Red Star Enterprise Linux, where I could give you an enterprise version with backported patches, but might get sued by my former employer for that one. So not generally available. So again, I could have fixed that. Here's the interesting one. 3, only available in the Korean language. And it's true. If you look at their scope statement, because the goal ultimately is to give information for downstream consumers within the US government community, products that are not available in English are explicitly out of scope, which is very interesting. So that's one example of sort of process failure. Here's another example. So again, I wrote them this email that I'd been pen testing these Android phones. One day at work, these Android phones appeared on our desks, plug it in, it's power over Ethernet, boots up, oh look, it's got an IP address. So let's take a look at this phone. Lo and behold, there's multiple RCE vulnerabilities, a backdoor actually installed by the Chinese developer, the SSH key left in root's authorized keys. So I wrote it all up and then emailed CVE assign saying, hey, can I get a CVE ID? Nothing. Followed up. Interestingly, there was a separate thread that was going on the OSS security list where I'm not the only person complaining about this stuff. There's tons of public references to this issue, where Steve Christie from Mitre was coming out saying, look, we know it's a problem, we're bottlenecked, we're held up, but if you want a status update or an acknowledgement of receipt, we will always give you that. So I said, can I at least get an acknowledgement of receipt? I never got any reply whatsoever. So non-deterministic process. Now, I apologize, I did these slides in OpenOffice on my Linux box, and they've now been converted to imperialist PowerPoint format. So we do appear to have some formatting issues. I'm sorry about that. I'll fix it up before I post these. But those are links to the issues I'm talking about here. So Mitre's public statement on all of this, so why? What's the problem here? We understand, all right, the scope issues with the Korean language and so on. All right, we can agree to disagree on that one, but this stuff like, I give you an ONOS vulnerability and I get a CVE back in 6 days. I give you 3 Grandstream vulnerabilities and I get nothing, not even an acknowledgement of receipt, which matches a lot of other people's understanding. Why? And they say it's because of our quality standards. Once we've issued a CVE ID, it's irrevocable, it's canonical. So we have to make sure it's right. And sometimes we get reports that are open shut cases and we can quickly assign it. And sometimes we get reports that are more ambiguous. So it takes us time, and we have no formal SLA. We can't make any promises on timeline. But of course, as I said, if you want just an acknowledgement or receipt or a status update, we'll give you that. But even that didn't really work. So this is a real shame, actually, this formatting. It may be a bit of a problem for this presentation. But oh well, we'll do what we can. So what are Mitre's quality standards like? Are they so high? Here's a wonderful write-up that was submitted to the OSS security list by a researcher named Justin Timberlake, whose email address is hellokitty@hotpants.net. And he describes a vulnerability in the simulated reaming algorithm of this software. which can be easily parameterized to achieve the desired rosebud. And he even provides a nice little snippet of the code here. In the request, immediately gets a CVE ID, 2-day turnaround for Justin Timberlake. What gives? Now, the best part of this vulnerability is, whoops, I'm having trouble with this. The best part of this vulnerability is the software that it allegedly exists in, if you go and you try and download it, it doesn't exist. It's a zip file full of randomly generated garbage. There's no source code. The sample exploit refers to the flange pointer, the fister pointer, Larry Emder, and the simulated reaming algorithm in software that doesn't exist, 2-day turnaround with a CVE ID. So they can't call quality on this. Sorry. So what alternatives do we have? We had, up until recently, earlier this year, we had OSVDB, run by Jericho at Attrition, where they, it was an open source vulnerability database, where they did provide identifiers that could be used, and particularly for the open source use case where this is problematic, it was a good alternative. For reasons unknown to me, it has been shut down. I think they pretty much had enough of doing all this work on behalf of the community, everybody leeching their data, everybody creating commercial products based on OSVDB data, and contributing nothing back, which is something I fully understand is a problem. There are also other national ones, CNVD and JVN. Now, I knew about JVN in the past because when I worked for Red Hat, we had some very big Japanese customers. And they would always, when referring to security issues, they wouldn't refer to the CVE ID, they wouldn't refer to a Mitre page or something, they would always refer to the JVN IPedia reference. And so I learnt about that. I had never actually heard of CNVD until recently. And we'll get to that in a minute. So none of those really seem like a viable alternative because OSVDB potentially is, someone could recreate it. But the Chinese one and the Japanese one, they share the exact same problem that the US one does. These are all national databases. It's just, as is the way of the world, the US one gets global hegemony and acts as a proxy for a global standard when it is in fact a national standard. So that's the root problem here. So what do? Do we stage a community takeover? And I'd been having increasingly angry Skype call rants with Kurt about this. Let's rabble, let's overthrow Mitre and form a vanguard party and take over CVE. And the way that we were planning to do it was to intentionally pollute the namespace because they're just numbers. So I'd just go out and say, hey, I've found this Groundstream vulnerability. It's CVE 2016 1234. And that's it. And what are they going to do? Are they going to start come out and publicly rebuking everybody? It was a way, and the system that I was proposing would not achieve anything except force the issue. It would, it would force chaos and force something to change. Kurt came at it from a different angle, and then in classic Kurt style, just went ahead and did it without me before I gave this presentation. And he came out with this thing called DWF, Distributed Weakness Filing. And it's actually a really smart idea, because it's the same basic system as CVE, except the naming authorities, anybody can be a naming authority. To be a naming authority, you go onto the GitHub repo that he has, allocating blocks, and you send a pull request, nominating yourself as a naming authority and claiming a block. So now all of those blocks can be namespaced back to the naming authority that assigned them, so you no longer have to elect a trust root. Like, Mitre's problem is they're saying, once something goes out, we've put our name on it and said, we think this is correct. Whereas here we're saying, well, anybody can namespace it and say they think it's correct, and then the end user chooses whose namespace they want to trust, which I think is a very scalable system. Because if you think about things like BGPsec, for example, if anybody's familiar with that, everybody, the same mail threads go round and round and round on the nanog list and so on. We've got to implement BGPsec, yes, but we have to elect a root. And if you propose any root, there will be an angry group of people who oppose that particular root. So it never gets anywhere. But this bypasses that problem altogether. So here's some, you can tell I'm a bit of an anarchist. The naming authorities that have already actually participated in this, there's some big names there. It started out with just individuals who were angry at the status quo, but then corporations and organizations have started to join in and actually create their own naming authorities. There is, though, limited uptake. I think there's limited uptake, especially in the downstream consumption. You're not seeing any tools consuming this yet and saying, you know, you're presenting a dashboard to the business of known vulnerabilities in their software, and instead of the CVE ID, you've got the DWF ID that came from the HackerOne namespace, or interestingly, the CERT2016 namespace. Now, there's a potential trust source. So I think this is something that I would really encourage people, if they care about this at all, to use, because it's one of those things where once you get critical mass and it's used, it will take off. But otherwise, it will just die on the vine, and that would be a real shame. So here's an exercise for the user. You've mostly got phones and laptops. If I'd presented from my laptop, I would have done it myself. But named vulnerabilities. If you caught the title of the presentation, I was dropping in all these named vulnerability references. Because up until dealing with this issue, I thought they were just a terrible thing, a blight on the security industry. It's all just cash grabbing and ego grabbing by security engineers to try and get press. Why would you do it? It's such a stupid idea. But it does have one really good property, which is it allows you to independently assign a canonical identifier to your vulnerability. You can just say it's whatever you want. You can say it's shell shock, it's logjam. For example, the one that I referred to earlier, the Red Star OS jailbreak, I'm going to call that one Gulag break. I just haven't got around to it yet. So I've now decided I'm actually going to give every vulnerability that I've ever found a name and a site and a logo. I found a while back the Roffle vulnerability, the rocket overloaded flags liability, and today I present to you, not on the screen, the phone vulnerability. So if you go to phwned.com, I have gone back to that grand stream vulnerability that Mitre would not assign a CVE ID for, and it's now the phone vulnerability with a logo that I hope you all really enjoy. So I would encourage you all to do the same, to do phone.com. So what are the next steps? I think I would really like to see the community rally around this effort. This is really something where we've got a simple problem, we've got a simple solution to it. It just needs uptake. It needs that critical mass. And the only way that's going to happen is if everybody just starts using it. If we just start, a lot of pen testing companies, every now and then they'll go pen test some open source software and write up an advisory to make themselves look good, to show their clients. They look at the cool kind of issues we can find, look at the technical write-up we can do, and they include the CVE ID, include the DWF ID, include a link back to the project. Kurt is really passionate about doing this and puts an enormous amount of his own time into it. So it's backed by someone who can really run it. And the other thing is, please, no more national standards as de facto international standards. This is something, we should have learnt this a long time ago. We should have learnt from ANSI going to UTF-8, but it seems that we haven't in the security world yet. And so that's it. Short and sweet. No, we're good.
So guys, so just a reminder, we don't have a microphone to go around, so if anyone had any questions, please do lodge it through the app. But just for the beginning of the presentation, still adapting to that, did anyone have any questions that we'll just speak out aloud?
How many DWF IDs have you assigned so far?
Me, personally? Personally, I've assigned none. I don't think it's easy to measure because what people do is go and take a block, and there's not a canonical register of what every single one that's been assigned is within that block. So you can see how much namespace has been consumed, but I'm not aware of a canonical list of what's been assigned. Yeah. Yes?
Is there any intention to backdate DWF using, say, the OSVDB and actually collect?
You absolutely could. That's why I love this system, because it's so flexible. You could go and create a namespace for the OSVDB backport project, and then just go and write a script that assigns one to every single entry that was in OSVDB. Feel free. That's kind of what I mean by the community uptake that's necessary to make this happen. Yeah?
So just another one on community uptake. Is there any view to actually have some sort of peer review or to maintain some sense of quality? One thing I saw in the
Yeah. Yeah, like the one in the software that doesn't even exist. So the idea is that this is a I don't know if anybody's familiar with the patent system, but you can file in the US patent system, you can file a US provisional patent. And basically, all that's validating is that you have filed something that is in the correct patent format. The middle of it could be talking about lambda, it doesn't matter, but if it's in the format, you file the provisional and then you get temporary protection. Then when you file a real patent application, an assessor actually reads every line of it and accepts it or rejects it. So the idea of DWF is to act as that sort of provisional, where you say, okay, I'm the researcher, I just want to get a canonical identifier so I can refer to it in my advisory. I don't really care past that point. You get the DWF ID, and then downstream from that process, if and when MITRE get to it, and if it falls within their scope, it graduates to getting a CVE ID, which goes through their process. And there's a register maintained of those graduations to CVE. Well, the idea there is that you've got a more, I mean, you could eventually get rid of it and say, well, MITRE's just another namespace in DWF. But they're not going to just give that up overnight to some guy from Canada whose pants-wearing status is ambiguous. So I think it'll be a process to get there. There was a guy in the back who had a question.
I think you maybe answered that. I guess just in terms of duplication of like with the DWF, obviously two people use a lot of the same thing.
Yeah, there is the potential for that duplication. Yeah, exactly. So I could assign an ID to an issue, you could assign another ID to the same issue in our namespaces, but MITRE would do the complex work of figuring out their dupes and just calling it one. Cool, okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. So again, just a reminder also to vote and leave some feedback using the leave feedback functionality on the app. And on that note, we can break for lunch.